In this 10-minute rapid game, I was white. I played d4, and we went into this King's Indian defense. Okay, bishop g7, e4, d6, all standard, main line, and now white has a choice, and I like to play the aggressive but somewhat rare f4. It's called the 4 pawns attack. But I haven't studied this in a long time and haven't played it as white in probably a year. So I don't remember all of the theory. My opponent castled. I played knight to f3. This is still the main line. So is c5. I want to advance with my d-pawn and try to be aggressive with my pawns. I can threaten e5 in some positions and get a nice strong pawn duo on d5 and e5. But my opponent plays e6 to challenge my center right away. And now is when I deviate from the main line. I play bishop d3. I don't fully understand it, but apparently that's not as good as the mainline move bishop to e2. And I do remember studying this move before, and play typically proceeds e takes d5, c takes d5, and then rook to e8 attacks that pawn for a second time, and the proper way to defend it is to drop this knight back to d2. And so this bishop belongs on e2 apparently, maybe to control this square, maybe to avoid getting attacked by that pawn there on d3 in some cases. But it wasn't a disaster to play the bishop to d3. I figured the bishop would already be guarding that pawn on e4 after a trade here on d5. So rook to e8 wouldn't gain a tempo. So my opponent did capture on d5, and I recaptured with the c pawn. I still want the ability to push the e pawn here, supported by my f pawn in the future. b5 was an unusual pawn sacrifice in this opening. I've never seen something like this before. I can take that pawn with one of two minor pieces, but it's very interesting, and I think the engine says that's an okay move here. In fact, it gives it all zeros an equal score here. I analyzed this for a while, and I took the pawn with the bishop, leaving the knight in place in case of a queen coming to a5. I don't want to face that check. And I realized that if I took on b5, black has the following option, and he took it. Knight takes e4 is a very nice follow-up to that pawn sacrifice on b5. Leaving the knight en prise on e4, and I take it, but here's the point. Queen to a5 check, forks the king and the bishop, and after that I have to decide how to give back a piece because I cannot save a piece. The only way to get out of check and protect the bishop is knight to c3, but that runs into bishop takes c3 check, removing the defender of the bishop on b5, and so I'm going to lose that piece anyway. I also have to watch out for the move rook to e8 coming and pinning this knight, so I need to be very careful here, and I decide to make a multi-purpose move, and it was the move the engine suggested in the post-game analysis, king to f2. So that gets me out of check, and after queen takes b5, it doesn't put me in check any further, and I'm not going to have a pinned knight after rook to e8. Also, I'll be able to develop this rook to e1 potentially and drop this king back to g1 and tuck it away. If I leave my king on e1 and the queen captures on b5, that can interfere with castling rights here, or the ability to castle. So king to f2 is the correct move. He wins his piece back, but I saw all the way through to this move knight takes d6. So it was a pawn sacrifice. I am now up a pawn in this position and attacking the queen on b5. I also have a dangerous passed d pawn here. However, the engine still rates this as about equal, even slightly better for black, even though he's down a pawn. He's got the bishop pair in an open position. This bishop is very strong, pinning my b pawn. He's got pressure on b2 right now from two directions. His rook can come to this file if he can chase that knight off, and my king is still not very comfortable in this position. My opponent plays queen to a6, which attacks my knight on d6, and rather than retreat it and waste a tempo and face another attacking move, I traded off for his powerful bishop, or his potentially powerful bishop. He takes back with the rook. Queen to e2, offering a trade of queens. I felt that was warranted since I'm a pawn up and he is in a slightly better position with his pieces. He declines to trade and plays queen to b6, putting more pressure on this pawn, which now is currently sufficiently guarded. I'm not worried about this discovered check here. I can always intercede with the bishop on e3 and attack the queen. So I play rook to e1, trying to get my rook out so I can tuck my king back in the corner. And then knight to d7, a good developing move. Bishop to e3, developing and pointing at the queen. That does allow black to capture a pawn here on b2, but I need to get my pieces active, and I have a further plan to play knight to e5 and potentially win a pawn back again, as you will see. My opponent takes b2 with his queen, and I decided on not taking his queen. I think the engine prefers that I do take the queen in this position. And then bishop takes b2 to follow and rook to b1 to attack the bishop. And I have a nice pair of rooks here controlling the two open files. But I decide to play rook from a to b1 and take control of that file immediately. Notice my queen is guarding the pawn on a2. And I give him the option of trading queens, and he takes it. And I take back with the rook. I want eventually a rook to protect this second rank here. I'm not sure if that's the best move, if it's better than taking back with the king, but I don't want to put my king onto the e file where a rook might show up. Okay, then rook ab8 to challenge my rook on the open file. Okay, I trade, and I feel safe with this rook invading down the b file because I have the second rank guarded. And then I play knight to e5, which I think is an attempt to win a pawn here. I want to eliminate this knight and take this pawn on c5, and I want to be able to push this d pawn, and I don't want that knight blockading it. So I put my knight on e5, threatening to take his knight, and then follow up by taking the pawn on c5. So he trades knights, and it looks like I'm giving up a pawn here by putting my knight on e5. It's only guarded once and it's attacked twice, but don't forget his pawn will be loose here. Not to mention the pawn on a7 is going to end up loose as well. So I think knight to e5 was the correct move in that position. Knight takes e5, f takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes c5, and now I have a double attack. The pawns are equal, but I'm attacking the bishop and the pawn on a7. And my rook is nicely guarding the a2 pawn, so that if I do take on a7 and his rook moves over to a8, I can move my bishop safely away without worrying about getting the pawn on a2 captured. So he has to save his bishop. He can move it, or he can play f6 like he did, and then I took the pawn on a7. Attacking the rook, now I'm a pawn up, and I have two dangerous passed pawns, so I think I'm in command of the position. But if you looked at the clocks at this point in this 10-minute game, you would have seen my opponent still had more than 8 minutes left in this position, and I think I had probably less than 3 minutes left in this position. So I had a big time disadvantage, but the position isn't too complicated, and let's see what happens. So rook to b7, attacking the bishop, falls back to e3. h5 I think is a mistake. The computer suggests putting the rook on b4 to stop the a-pawn's advance, and I should push to a4 right now before I give him a chance to play rook to b4, but instead I save my h2 pawn from potential capture in the future. It was immune on the last move because after capturing I could always play g3 and trap the bishop. But I figure I'm going to put my pawns on light squares away from the influence of his dark square bishop. And he does not take advantage of that lapse and play rook b4. Instead he moves his king up, and that allows me to play a4 at this point. And I can get my rook behind the pawn anytime I need to and push it as a threat. And this bishop is nicely guarding the a7 square, and this pawn can be a threat as well. Okay, so king to e7. He's heading for the d6 square, so I take time out here to play bishop to c5 check to keep him off of that square, so all of these squares are out of bounds for the black king. So king to d7, rook to a2 getting behind the passed pawn, rook to c7 attacking the bishop. So it moves to b6 to attack the rook, and I'm preparing the next move a5. So I have this nice solid structure here, and I can maybe bring the king up and see what kinds of threats I can make. So a pawn up and some passed pawns, I felt like this was a decisive position even though I had a huge time deficit, probably a minute and a half on the clock at this point to my opponent's 6 or 7 minutes. Okay, king can come up here though to d6 and threaten that pawn. And I spent quite a deal of my last 90 seconds with this move right here, making sure, checking all possibilities that I could play the move a6 safely and give up my bishop. And I did analyze it correctly. It is a correct sacrifice because the pawn cannot be stopped. So he should not take the bishop. I don't think there's a much better defense other than groveling back on b8 and a8 here. But he took the bishop, and he didn't take much time to do it either. I think he played too quickly throughout the entire game. And this allows the move a7, and notice his rook cannot get back now or behind the pawn. The pawn is going to queen. He has only one shot at stopping my pawn, and this is what I had to analyze when sacrificing my bishop. I had to analyze the move bishop to d4 check, and that puts it in line with my pawn. His rook is in the way, so I have only one winning move in this position, and it is rook to e2. If I move my rook anywhere else, the position will either be drawn or even slightly in black's favor. For example, if I move my king to f3 here, then he can check the king, and once it moves out of check, he'll be able to take that pawn, sacrificing his bishop back, and then he will win this pawn as well, and he'll have a 3-2 majority to play in the endgame. So I cannot allow a check on these squares or on these squares. The king can also check on b1. So I had to play king to e2, and I had to make certain of all of that as soon as I determined to play a6 in this position. So this is how the game went, king to e2. Rook to b2 check must be played if he doesn't want to see a queen on the board. He has to sacrifice his rook to take the a7 pawn. And now he has to play rook versus bishop, but I have less than a minute to convert this, and I have to be very careful, and I probably didn't play the best chess in this endgame here, but I didn't blunder. So rook to a2, bishop to d4. The bishop was under attack, which gave me time to protect my d5 pawn from the side. I don't want to lose that pawn. It would be very hard for me to convert in a quick time control the position remaining, and I'm not even sure it is a win. So king to e5, king comes up, my king comes up to d3, bishop falls back, and king to c4. I'm trying to get my king up the board here to support the push of the d pawn. It's not so easy though. The bishop has that square controlled, and if I move over here, I'm blocking the control of my d pawn, which can be captured. So g5, push my rook up now that my king is guarding the pawn, so I'm now threatening to push the pawn one more square. He pushes to g4. I take the time to trade pawns. I'm not sure if that made any difference. d6, I push the pawn. King to e6, he has to stop it from being pushed any further. But I can get my king up at this point. I couldn't go to these squares, so I have to go all the way to b5. And now the king moves up and blockades the pawn, and so I decide to head back. King to c4. And he probably could have put up a more stubborn defense by playing right back to where he was and forcing me to rethink the position. But he played f5, which allowed me to play king to d5, which made my life easy, because now I'll be able to push the king back and push the pawn even further. So f4, he's trying to get counterplay and produce a passed pawn. Rook to a4, I stop to attack these pawns. I can't play here, check. The bishop has that square covered. He pushes to f3, and I decide now is a great opportunity to trade pawns because I'll be able to get both of his pawns for my single pawn. G takes f3. He probably should have pushed here, but he took the pawn back, allowing rook to f4, and there's no defense of this pawn. And this should be pretty easy with the 20 or 30 seconds I had left. Although I did have to be very careful. I almost blew it in this position. When he attacked my rook, I was about to take the pawn on f3, and if I had, the position would have been drawn. If I had taken that pawn, he would have had bishop takes pawn, and the computer tells me that this particular precise position is drawn, as most rook versus bishop endings are. Okay, except in special circumstances. So before taking the pawn, I had to play rook to f7 check to drive his rook back to the 8th rank, and then I could take the pawn. Bishop to h4, I bring the king up. I'm threatening all kinds of things like rook to h3, attacking the bishop, followed by a potential mate here. He plays very clever, playing on the fact that I'm down to 10 or 15 seconds in this position, and he has about 4 or 5 minutes on his clock. So he throws everything at me. He plays bishop to e7, and I did not take it because that would result in an immediate stalemate. So I played d7 check, king to d8, and now I see a win, or at least I see a way to queen my pawn. Rook to c3, threatening rook to c8 mate, and again he plays a nice move, bishop to c5, tempting me to take that bishop with less than 10 seconds on the clock. If I do, again it's an immediate stalemate. So I measure time here on the c file, either forcing the bishop away, and once it moves away then rook to c8 is a mate, or he has to give up the bishop, which he did. And he moves his king to b6, threatening the rook. Probably the safest and fastest way to convert this position would have been to move my king over to guard the rook, and then get the queen, and then play the queen to the b file and mate very quickly. But I had to think of a way to do this in 5 seconds with pre-moves without thinking too much, and I'm not a very fast player in that kind of time pressure. So I give up the rook because I know how to mindlessly win with the king and queen. Okay, and that went pretty well as I expected. I anticipated his moves very nicely and mated him in the corner. So I was happy with that game. It brought me to my highest rapid rating to date. Thanks for watching.